The summer of 1980 cast long shadows across Millfield, Pennsylvania. Beyond the cheerful facade of county fairs and backyard barbecues, something sinister was taking root in this quiet railroad town of just under 12,000 souls. Back then, Millfield was the kind of place where children played freely until streetlights buzzed to life, their amber glow signaling time to head home. Unlocked doors were common, and neighbors knew each other by name. The Harmon triplets, Catherine, Elizabeth, and James, had just celebrated their 10th birthday on June 15th. Their father, Richard Harmon, had constructed an elaborate treehouse in their backyard, a castle in the clouds for his three miracles, as he called them. To understand what happened on August 17, 1980, we must first understand the Harmon family. Nancy and Richard Harmon had tried for years to have children. After multiple miscarriages and a devastating stillbirth, the couple had almost given up hope. When Nancy became pregnant again in late 1969, doctors advised caution. No one expected triplets. Their birth was considered nothing short of miraculous in Millfield Community Hospital. Local newspapers documented the arrival of the Harmon triplets with enthusiastic headlines. 3 times the joy for Millfield couple. Their birth became part of local lore, a story of perseverance and hope. For the first decade of their lives, Catherine, Elizabeth, and James were inseparable, identical in appearance but distinct in personality. Catherine, Katie, to family and friends, was the natural leader, first to speak, first to walk, first to climb the massive oak tree in their backyard. Elizabeth Beth was the quiet observer, thoughtful and meticulous, with an uncanny talent for remembering details. James Jamie was the peacemaker, gentle and kind, always looking out for his sisters despite being the youngest by 7 minutes. Nancy Harmon kept meticulous photo albums documenting their childhood, matching outfits at Christmas, birthday parties with 3 identical cakes, first days of school with 3 identical lunchboxes. In these photographs, now faded with time, the triplets appear happy, their smiles genuine, their futures bright. Richard Harmon worked at the Millfield Steel Mill, putting in long hours to provide for his family. By 1980, he had been promoted to floor supervisor, a position that brought respect and a modest increase in salary. Nancy worked part-time as a secretary at the elementary school the triplets attended, allowing her to be home when they returned from school. On the surface, the Harmons were the embodiment of the American dream. Hard-working parents, 3 healthy children, a 2-story home on Elm Street with a station wagon in the driveway, and a golden retriever named Rusty, who followed the triplets everywhere. But beneath this perfect surface, hairline fractures were beginning to show. The summer of 1980 was unusually hot in Pennsylvania. Record-breaking temperatures stretched from June through August, turning the normally green landscape brittle and brown. Water restrictions were implemented. The creek where children normally played ran low and sluggish. The heat made people irritable, quick to anger, slow to forgive. In the months leading up to August 17th, neighbors would later recall subtle changes in the Harmon household. Richard's hours at the mill increased as rumors of layoffs circulated. The steel industry was beginning its slow decline, though few in Millfield wanted to acknowledge it. Nancy had started taking medication for what she described as nerves. The triplets, once inseparable, had begun to develop individual friendships and interests as they approached adolescence. Catherine had joined the swim team, spending long hours at the community pool. Elizabeth had discovered the public library, often returning home with stacks of books that she would devour in the cool shade of the treehouse. James had befriended the Nolan boy from 3 streets over, the 2 of them constructing elaborate models and trading baseball cards. This natural drift apart wasn't unusual for siblings approaching their teen years, but in identical triplets who had spent a decade as a single unit, the separation was more pronounced, more noticeable to those who had known them since birth. August 17, 1980 began like any other summer Sunday in Millfield. The Harmons attended the 9:30 service at First Presbyterian Church, as they did every Sunday. Reverend Thomas Douglas would later recall that all 5 Harmons were present, dressed in their Sunday best. Nancy appeared tired but engaged, singing hymns in her clear soprano. Richard seemed preoccupied, checking his watch several times during the service. The triplets sat together in the same pew, but church member Dorothy Wilson would later tell investigators she noticed something odd. The children weren't whispering or passing notes as they usually did. They sat unnaturally still, their expressions solemn at the time. She thought perhaps they had been scolded before the service for misbehavior. In hindsight, she wondered if they somehow sensed what was coming. After church, the family declined an invitation to the Wilsons for Sunday lunch, something they would normally have accepted. Richard explained they had plans to visit Nancy's sister in Pittsburgh, about an hour's drive away. They would need to leave shortly after returning home to change clothes. This was the first inconsistency investigators would later uncover. Nancy's sister, Judith Miller, stated categorically that no such visit had been planned. She hadn't spoken to Nancy in nearly 3 weeks. What is known with certainty is that the Harmon family returned to their home at 43 Elm Street at approximately 11:15 a.m. Several neighbors saw them pull into their driveway in their blue Ford station wagon. The family entered the house together. No one would see the triplets alive again. At 5:47 p.m., Richard Harmon called the Millfield Police Department from a payphone outside Wilson's grocery, his voice so frantic that dispatcher Donna Lee initially had difficulty understanding him. "My children are gone," he kept repeating. "Someone has taken my children." Officer Patrick Callahan was the first to respond, arriving at the Harmon residence at 5:56 p.m. He found Nancy Harmon sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall. According to his initial report, she appeared to be in shock, unresponsive to questions, her hands trembling as she clutched a child's hair ribbon. Richard Harmon was agitated, pacing the living room, alternating between shouting accusations and breaking down in tears. His account of the afternoon was disjointed, contradictory. Initially, he claimed that after returning from church, the family had lunch together. The triplets then asked permission to play in their treehouse while he and Nancy took afternoon naps, exhausted from the heat and a week of work. When they awoke around 5:30 p.m., the children were nowhere to be found. The physical evidence immediately contradicted this account. There was no sign of lunch having been prepared or consumed. The treehouse, when examined, showed no indication of recent use, no fresh fingerprints, no moved objects, no disturbance to the layer of dust that had accumulated on the wooden floor. When confronted with these inconsistencies, Richard changed his story. Now he claimed Nancy hadn't been feeling well after church. She had taken one of her nerve pills and gone to lie down. He had made sandwiches for the triplets, then allowed them to ride their bicycles to the nearby park, something they were permitted to do together. But the children's bicycles were found in the garage, neatly parked in their usual spots, undisturbed. By 7:30 p.m., with darkness approaching and the Harmons' accounts increasingly problematic, Chief of Police Edward Brennan made the decision to issue a missing persons alert for the Harmon triplets. By 8:15 p.m., the first search parties were forming in the front yard of First Presbyterian Church. Volunteers equipped with flashlights and walkie-talkies provided by the local radio shack. The initial search focused on areas the triplets were known to frequent: the community pool, now closed for the evening; the public library, also closed; the creek that ran behind the elementary school; and the small wooded area locals called the forest, though it was barely 5 acres of trees and underbrush. The search continued through the night, with no sign of the children. By morning, state police had joined the effort. The FBI would become involved 48 hours later, when it became clear this was not a case of children wandering off or temporarily running away. As the investigation progressed, disturbing details emerged about the Harmon household. Neighbors who had initially described the family as ideal began to recall incidents that in retrospect seemed ominous. Marion Fitzgerald, who lived directly across the street, remembered an argument between Richard and Nancy that had spilled onto their front lawn in early July. He was shouting about money, about sacrifices. She told investigators. Nancy was crying, begging him to lower his voice because of the children. Thomas Nolan, father of James's friend, recalled a conversation with Richard at a 4th of July barbecue. He'd had a few beers and started talking about the mill, about layoffs coming. He said he didn't know how he'd support his family if he lost his job. He seemed desperate, said he'd been looking into insurance policies. At the time, I thought he meant health insurance. Now I wonder. Perhaps most disturbing were the observations of the triplets' teacher, Diane Foster. She had noticed changes in all 3 children during the last month of the school year. Catherine became very protective of her siblings, watching them constantly. Elizabeth stopped raising her hand in class, though she knew all the answers. And James, he started having accidents, wetting himself during class, something he hadn't done since kindergarten. When asked if she had reported these concerns, Foster admitted she had spoken to Nancy Harmon at the end-of-year conference. Nancy dismissed it, said the children were just excited about summer vacation. But there was something in her eyes, fear, maybe. I should have pushed harder. The Harmon's home yielded few clues. The triplets' bedrooms were immaculately kept, beds made with hospital corners, toys arranged on shelves, clothes neatly folded in drawers. Too neat, investigators would later observe, as if prepared for inspection. The backyard showed no signs of struggle or disturbance. The treehouse, once a symbol of childhood joy, stood empty, a sentinel with nothing to guard. Initial suspicion fell heavily on Richard and Nancy Harmon. Their contradictory statements, the lack of evidence supporting their timeline, and Richard's increasingly erratic behavior made them natural suspects. Yet there was no physical evidence linking them directly to the disappearance. No blood, no signs of violence in the home. Nancy remained in a state of near catatonia, barely speaking, requiring sedation from the family doctor. When she did speak, her words were often cryptic, disconnected. "They are in the light," she told Officer Callahan on the 3rd day of the investigation. "My angels are in the light." Whether this was the rambling of a heavily medicated, traumatized mother, or something more sinister was impossible to determine. Richard, meanwhile, swung between rage and despair. He lashed out at investigators, accusing them of wasting time questioning the family when they should be searching for the real kidnapper. Then, minutes later, he would collapse in tears, begging forgiveness for unspecified failings as a father. 1 week into the investigation, with no significant leads and mounting pressure from the media and the community, the focus shifted. Perhaps someone outside the family had taken the triplets. Millfield had always seemed safe, insulated from the crime that plagued larger cities, but no town is immune to darkness. Investigators began looking at known sex offenders in a 50-mile radius, reviewing recent releases from state penitentiaries, interviewing anyone with a history of crimes against children. This approach yielded one promising lead: Gerald Maxwell, a former Millfield resident who had served 8 years for the attempted abduction of a 12-year-old girl in nearby Bedford County. Maxwell had been released from Western State Penitentiary 6 months earlier and was living with his mother in Huntingdon, about 30 miles from Millfield. When questioned, Maxwell provided alibis for August 17th that initially seemed solid. He claimed to have been at church in the morning and at his cousin's wedding reception in the afternoon and evening. However, the church secretary had no record of his attendance that Sunday, and his cousin's wedding reception had ended at 3:00 p.m., leaving several hours unaccounted for before the triplets were reported missing. A search of Maxwell's mother's home and vehicle revealed nothing connected to the Harmon children. No clothing, no toys, no physical evidence linking him to Millfield on that day. Still, given his history and the gaps in his alibi, Maxwell remained a person of interest throughout the initial investigation. As August turned to September, the search for the Harmon triplets dominated national headlines. Their photographs, 3 identical faces, with subtle differences, Only those who knew them well could distinguish appeared on television screens across America. The case was featured on the fledgling program America's Most Wanted, generating hundreds of tips, most leading nowhere. There were reported sightings in shopping malls in Ohio, at rest stops in New Jersey, in amusement parks in Virginia. Each was investigated, each proved false. The triplets had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. In Millfield, the community's initial unity in the face of tragedy began to fracture. Those who believed the parents were involved avoided those who thought an outside kidnapper was responsible. The Harmons, once the town's most admired family, became pariahs, the objects of whispered speculation and outright accusation. Nancy Harmon was hospitalized in early September after what was described as a nervous breakdown. She would spend 6 weeks in the psychiatric ward of Millfield Community Hospital, heavily sedated, barely communicating. Richard, left alone in the house that had once echoed with children's laughter, turned to alcohol. Neighbors reported hearing him shouting in the middle of the night, having arguments with people who weren't there. He stopped going to work, eventually losing his position at the mill. By October, the FBI had officially classified the case as a suspected homicide, though no bodies had been found. The reasoning was statistical: children missing for more than a month rarely turn up alive, but the designation shifted the investigation's focus. They were no longer searching for living children but for remains, for graves, for disposal sites. The woods around Millfield were systematically combed. The creek was dragged. Abandoned mines in the area were explored. Nothing was found. On November 12, 1980, nearly 3 months after the triplets' disappearance, Richard Harmon was found dead in the family garage, the victim of carbon monoxide poisoning. His death was ruled a suicide. The note he left was brief and ambiguous. "I'm sorry, I couldn't protect them. They deserved better." Whether this was an admission of guilt or the final despair of a father who had failed to keep his children safe remains one of the central questions of the case. Nancy, still hospitalized when her husband died, showed little reaction to the news. Her doctor noted in his report, "Patient exhibits flat affect when informed of spouse's death. No tears, no questions, no visible distress. Continued to stare out window as if waiting for something or someone." She would be released from the hospital in December, but the Nancy Harmon who returned to 43 Elm Street was a shell of her former self. She moved through the house like a ghost, refusing to change anything in the triplets' rooms, leaving their Christmas stockings hanging by the fireplace, their places set at the dinner table. Neighbors reported hearing her talking to the empty air, having conversations with children who weren't there. Some, out of pity or perhaps superstition, began to avoid the Harmon house altogether, crossing to the other side of the street when passing by. Nancy would remain in the house until 1983, when a distant cousin from California finally convinced her to sell the property and move west. The house at 43 Elm Street would change hands several times over the coming decades, its history always disclosed to new owners, its reputation as a haunted or at least unlucky house firmly established in local law. The investigation into the disappearance of the Harmon triplets grew cold. Other cases demanded attention. Resources were reallocated. Witnesses moved away or died. Memories faded. The thick file of interview transcripts, photographs, and reports was eventually archived. One more unsolved mystery in the annals of American crime. But in small towns, stories don't die. They evolve, gaining details with each retelling, becoming part of the collective consciousness. Cautionary tales passed from generation to generation. Children in Millfield grew up hearing about the Harmon triplets. Don't stay out after dark or you will disappear like the Harmon kids. Don't go near the old Harmon house. It's cursed. Every Halloween, teenagers would dare each other to approach the property, to peek in windows, to leave offerings on the front porch. 3 apples, 3 candles, 3 pennies for luck. As the years passed, the story of the Harmon triplets became intertwined with other local legends. The ghost lights seen on abandoned railway tracks, The woman in white who appeared at crossroads during storms, the unexplained sounds heard near the old mill when the wind blew from the east. In official records, the case remained open, but inactive. Occasionally, a new detective would pull the file, review the evidence, perhaps conduct a few interviews with surviving witnesses, but the conclusion was always the same. Without new information, the disappearance of Catherine, Elizabeth, and James Harmon would remain unsolved. Then, in the spring of 2024, 44 years after the triplets vanished, a real estate developer purchased the property at 43 Elm Street, along with several adjacent lots. The plan was to demolish the aging homes and construct modern condominiums. The Harmon house, which had stood vacant for nearly a decade, was scheduled for demolition on May 5th. Mason Reed, a 26-year-old contractor working for East Lake Development, was conducting a final walkthrough of the property on May 14th. His job was simple: make sure all utilities had been properly disconnected, ensure the house was empty of personal belongings, and check for any structural issues that might complicate demolition. Reed had grown up in Millfield. He knew the stories about the Harmon house, had participated in the Halloween dares as a teenager. He approached the assignment with a mixture of professional detachment and morbid curiosity. The house was in poor condition after years of neglect. Water damage had caused portions of the ceiling to collapse. Mice had gnawed through walls. The once cheerful yellow kitchen was now grimy and peeling. Reed moved methodically through the house, checking each room, making notes on his clipboard. When he reached the basement, he noticed something odd about the northern wall, while the other walls were unfinished, revealing concrete foundation. This wall had been covered with drywall that was now buckling from moisture. Curious, Reed tapped on the wall, hearing a hollow sound. Using the claw end of his hammer, he pried away a section of drywall, expecting to find mold or perhaps evidence of amateur plumbing repairs. What he found instead would shock the community and reopen one of Millfield's oldest wounds. Behind the drywall was a small alcove, approximately 6 feet wide by 4 feet deep. The space had been created by constructing a false wall in front of the original foundation. Inside this hidden chamber were 3 small objects, arranged in a neat row: a child's worn sneaker, size 4, a hair ribbon, once blue, now faded to gray, and a plastic action figure, the kind that was popular in the late. Reed, recognizing the potential significance of his discovery, immediately contacted his supervisor, who notified the Millfield Police Department. Detective Allison Hayes, a 32-year veteran of the force who had been a rookie officer during the original investigation, arrived at the scene within 20 minutes. Her reaction upon seeing the hidden alcove and its contents was captured by Reed's body cam. She removed her glasses, closed her eyes briefly, and whispered, "My God, after all these years." The items were carefully documented, photographed, and removed for forensic analysis. Preliminary examination confirmed what many already suspected. The sneaker matched the description of the footwear James Harmon had been wearing on the day of his disappearance, according to the original police report. The hair ribbon was consistent with the type Nancy Harmon often used in her daughter's hair, but it was what forensic technicians discovered behind the false wall that would transform a decades-old missing persons case into something far more horrifying, and lead investigators down a path no one in Millfield could have anticipated. As the wall was completely removed, revealing the full extent of the hidden chamber, technicians noticed discoloration in the soil floor. Using ground-penetrating radar, they detected anomalies extending several feet below the surface. What they would unearth in the coming days would not only provide answers about the fate of the Harmon triplets, but would also expose a secret that had been buried in Millfield for almost half a century. A secret that would implicate not just the Harmon family, but several of the town's most respected citizens. The true nightmare was only beginning to reveal itself. The discovery at 43 Elm Street transformed Millfield overnight. News vans lined the once quiet street. Satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking light. Yellow crime scene tape created a perimeter around the property, fluttering in the spring breeze, a garish reminder of wounds reopened. Inside the house, beneath the harsh glare of industrial lights, forensic anthropologist Dr. Eleanor Vance directed a team of specialists as they methodically excavated the basement floor. Their movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial in their precision. Each layer of soil was carefully removed, sifted, documented. The basement had become an archaeological dig site, with the past being exhumed 1 centimeter at a time. "We are not just looking for remains," Dr. Vance explained to Detective Hayes on the second day of excavation. "We are looking for a narrative. Every soil layer tells a story. Every artifact has context." By the end of the first week, that narrative was beginning to emerge, written in the earth beneath the Harmon house. 3 distinct depressions were identified in the soil, each approximately 4 feet long by 2 feet wide. These depressions contained higher concentrations of calcium and phosphorus than the surrounding soil, chemical signatures consistent with the decomposition of human remains. But the bodies themselves were gone. "It's not uncommon in cases like this," Dr. Vance noted in her preliminary report. "If the perpetrator became concerned about discovery, they might return to move remains to a secondary location. What we are seeing here is evidence that bodies were once present but were subsequently removed." Forensic analysis of soil samples indicated the original burials had occurred approximately 40 to 45 years earlier, consistent with the disappearance of the Harmon triplets. More disturbing was evidence suggesting the bodies had been removed much more recently, perhaps within the last 5 to 7 years. For Detective Hayes, this revelation was particularly unsettling. Someone knew we might eventually find this place. She told the task force assembled to investigate the case. Someone was still actively concealing evidence decades after the original crime. The items discovered in the hidden alcove, the sneaker, the ribbon, the action figure yielded more concrete evidence. DNA extracted from the interior of the sneaker matched samples provided by Nancy Harmon's cousin in California. This was unquestionably James Harmon's shoe. Similarly, hairs caught in the fabric of the ribbon were consistent with the DNA profile of Elizabeth Harmon. These findings transformed what had been a missing persons case into a confirmed homicide investigation. The Harmon triplets had been murdered and buried in the basement of their family home, and years later someone had removed their remains but left behind these personal items. Whether as an oversight or as some macabre form of memorial remained unclear. The most logical suspects, Richard and Nancy Harmon, were both deceased. Nancy had died in a California nursing home in 2007. Never having spoken in detail about the events of August 17, 1980, her medical records indicated a diagnosis of catatonic schizophrenia in her later years. She had taken whatever knowledge she possessed to her grave. With the primary suspects beyond the reach of justice, investigators turned their attention to understanding the broader context of the crime. Who else might have been involved? Who had returned to move the remains years after the initial burials? And perhaps most importantly, where were the bodies now? To answer these questions, Detective Hayes and her team began a comprehensive review of the original investigation. They reached out to surviving witnesses, re-examined old statements, and applied modern forensic techniques to evidence that had been preserved for over 4 decades. One of their first interviews was with Thomas Nolan, now 78 years old and living in a retirement community in Harrisburg. Nolan's son had been James Harmon's closest friend in the summer of 19. Though his memory had faded over the years, certain details remained vivid. "Jimmy was scared those last few weeks," Nolan recalled, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched a mug of tea. "Not the normal scared, like of monsters under the bed. Real scared. Adult scared. He told my boy that his dad had been having bad thoughts since losing his job at the mill." This statement contradicted the original investigation's timeline. According to employment records, Richard Harmon hadn't been laid off from the Millfield steel mill until September 1980, weeks after the triplets' disappearance. Had he known about impending layoffs, or had something else happened at the mill that summer, something never disclosed to investigators? Hayes dispatched 2 detectives to track down former employees of the now-defunct steel mill. Most had scattered after the facility closed permanently in 1992, but a few remained in the area, including former security guard Walter Kirby. Kirby, now in his late 80s, initially seemed reluctant to speak about Richard Harmon. Only after assurances that his statement would remain confidential unless required for court proceedings did he reveal a crucial detail omitted from the original investigation. Rich was caught stealing, Kirby stated flatly. Not small stuff. Industrial copper wiring, machine parts, things he could sell for scrap. Management didn't want publicity, so they gave him a choice: quiet resignation or criminal charges. This was early August, just days before those poor kids disappeared. This revelation cast Richard Harmon's increasingly erratic behavior and financial concerns in a new light. Had he murdered his children in some twisted attempt to spare them the shame of his professional disgrace? Or had the impending loss of income triggered a psychotic break? The financial angle gained further credibility when investigators uncovered insurance policies Richard had taken out on each of the triplets just months before their disappearance. Each policy was worth $25,000, a substantial sum in 1980, with double indemnity clauses for accidental death. But he never collected, Hayes pointed out during a task force briefing. We have confirmed with the insurance company that no claim was ever filed, even after the children were officially declared dead. This contradiction troubled investigators. If financial gain was the motive, why hadn't Richard pursued the insurance money? And if he had been guilty, why maintain the charade of searching for his children when he knew exactly where they were buried? Another significant breakthrough came from re-examining Nancy Harmon's medical records from Millfield Community Hospital. Her psychiatric evaluation in September 1980 contained notes from Dr. Edwin Porter that hadn't been fully shared with investigators at the time. Patient exhibits symptoms consistent with acute trauma and dissociation. Porter had written, during brief periods of lucidity, she makes concerning statements about the ceremony and the sacrifice. When asked directly about the children's whereabouts, patient becomes agitated and repeats phrase, "They are in the light now," while making circular gestures with her right hand. Dr. Porter, now deceased, had apparently interpreted these statements as manifestations of religious delusions related to Nancy's grief. But Hayes wondered if there might be a more literal interpretation. Could the ceremony and the sacrifice refer to actual events? Could the light be a specific location rather than a metaphysical concept? This line of inquiry led investigators to explore another aspect of Millfield's history that had received little attention in the original investigation: the presence of a small religious group known locally as the Covenant of Light. Founded in the early 1970s by former Presbyterian minister Thomas Douglas, the same Reverend Douglas who had presided over services at First Presbyterian Church, the Covenant had attracted a modest following among Millfield residents seeking more direct spiritual experiences than mainstream churches offered. Most in town had viewed the group as harmless, if somewhat eccentric. They met in members' homes, practiced meditation, and emphasized personal revelation over scriptural authority. By the mid-1980s, the group had disbanded, with Douglas relocating to Arizona, where he established a larger spiritual center that operated until his death in what hadn't been widely known in 1980 and what current investigators discovered in archived local newspapers was that both Nancy and Richard Harmon had been involved with the Covenant in its early years. Their names appeared on a membership roster published as part of a human interest story in the Millfield Gazette in 1974. They had apparently drifted away from the group after the triplets' birth, returning to the mainstream Presbyterian congregation. Thomas Douglas had been interviewed during the original investigation, providing information about the Harmon's attendance at church on the morning of August 7. Nothing in the records suggested investigators had explored his connection to the Covenant or questioned him about the Harmon's prior involvement with his group. Unfortunately, with Douglas deceased, direct questioning was impossible. However, several former members of the Covenant were still alive, including Dorothy Wilson, the same church member who had noticed the triplets' unusual behavior during the Sunday service before their disappearance. When re-interviewed in 2024, Wilson was initially reluctant to discuss the Covenant. "It was a different time," she said repeatedly. "We were searching for meaning, for connection. There was nothing sinister about it." But as the interview progressed, disturbing details emerged. The Covenant had apparently taken a darker turn around 1978, when Douglas began speaking of necessary sacrifices and purification through blood. Some members, including Wilson, had become uncomfortable with this rhetoric and distanced themselves from the group. Thomas became obsessed with triplets, Wilson revealed after hours of careful questioning. He said they were spiritually significant, that they represented body, mind, and spirit in physical form. He talked about them being vessels for divine light. Asked if she had shared this information with police in 1980. Wilson became defensive. "You have to understand the climate back then." Thomas was respected in the community. Nobody wanted to believe he could be involved in anything like that. And after Richard's suicide, everyone just assumed he was guilty. It seemed kinder to let it rest. This new information shifted the focus of the investigation dramatically. Had the Harmon triplets been victims not of parental malice, but of religious fanaticism? Had Reverend Douglas somehow convinced Richard and Nancy to participate in a ritual sacrifice of their own children? It seemed incredible, yet the evidence increasingly pointed in that direction. Investigators began examining property records associated with Douglas and other known members of the Covenant. They discovered that Douglas had owned a cabin on Blackwater Lake, about 15 miles outside Millfield. The property had been sold in 2002 after his death, and the cabin itself had been demolished to make way for a modern vacation home. With permission from the current owners, forensic teams conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys of the property. Initial results were inconclusive, but excavation of a small area behind where the original cabin had stood revealed fragments of bone that preliminary analysis identified as human. As the investigation progressed, the team made another critical discovery by re-interviewing Gerald Maxwell, the convicted child predator who had been a person of interest now in his 70s and still living in Pennsylvania under supervised release. Maxwell had maintained his innocence in the Harmon case for over 4 decades. During this new interview, with the pressure of direct evidence from the basement excavation, Maxwell finally admitted to having been in Millfield on the day of the triplets' disappearance, but not to abduct children. "I was there for a meeting," he confessed. "Douglas had reached out to several of us who had left the Covenant, said he needed witnesses for some kind of special ceremony. I didn't know what it was about, but I was trying to get back into the church's good graces after prison." Maxwell claimed he had arrived at the First Presbyterian Church around 3 p.m., where he was met by Douglas and 2 other men he didn't recognize. They drove to a private residence, which Maxwell now believes was the Harmon home, but he never went inside. "I waited in the car," he insisted. After about an hour, Douglas came out looking shaken. He told me I wasn't needed after all, and gave me $50 to keep quiet about being there. I took it. Who was going to believe an ex-con over a minister anyway? Maxwell's statement, while self-serving, provided the first eyewitness account, placing Reverend Douglas at the Harmon residence on the afternoon of the triplets' disappearance. It also suggested others had been involved, others who might still be alive and in the Millfield area. One name kept recurring in interviews with former Covenant members: Dr. Edwin Porter, the psychiatrist who had treated Nancy Harmon and whose notes had mentioned the ceremony and the sacrifice. Porter had been a founding member of the Covenant alongside Douglas, though he had maintained a more discreet association due to his professional position in the community. Porter had died in 2018 at the age of 89. His personal papers had been donated to the Millfield Historical Society by his daughter, including journals spanning several decades. When investigators reviewed these materials, They found entries from the summer of 1980 that were deeply troubling. TD has gone too far, Porter wrote, on August 10, 1980. His obsession with the H children has crossed into dangerous territory. R seems willing, desperate even, but N is hesitant. I have tried to counsel moderation, suggested symbolic rather than literal interpretation, but TD is convinced actual blood is required. God help us all if he proceeds. An entry from August 18th, the day after the disappearance, was even more damning. It's done. May God forgive us. TD says the light has been contained, that the vessels have fulfilled their purpose. R is unraveling rapidly. N has retreated into herself entirely. I have prescribed sedation, but medicine cannot heal this kind of wound. I fear we have all been irrevocably corrupt. These journal entries provided the clearest evidence yet of a conspiracy involving Reverend Douglas, Dr. Porter, and possibly others in the deaths of the Harmon triplets. They also suggested Richard and Nancy had some level of knowledge or involvement, though Nancy's subsequent psychiatric state indicated she may have been coerced or manipulated. As investigators pieced together this narrative of religious fanaticism and psychological manipulation, they also continued searching for the triplets' remains. The evidence from Dr. Porter's journal pointed to the initial burial in the basement, but didn't explain the subsequent removal of the bodies decades later. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mason Reed, the contractor who had discovered the hidden alcove, approached Detective Hayes 2 weeks into the investigation with information he had initially dismissed as unimportant. There was an old man who used to visit the house, Reed explained, while it was vacant before we bought the property. I'd see him sometimes when I was doing preliminary assessments. White-haired guy with a cane. He'd just stand across the street and stare at the place for hours. I figured he was just some local with memories of the neighborhood. When shown photographs of individuals connected to the case, Reed immediately identified William Carpenter, who had served as a deacon at First Presbyterian Church in 1980 and had been a known member of the Covenant. Carpenter, now 82, still lived in Millfield in a nursing home facility. Initial attempts to interview Carpenter were unsuccessful. He appeared confused, his responses disjointed and rambling. However, nursing staff confirmed he had been physically capable of leaving the facility unescorted until a recent hip surgery, approximately 2 years ago, consistent with the forensic timeline for when the remains had been moved from the basement. After consulting with Carpenter's physicians and obtaining proper legal clearances, investigators arranged for a geriatric psychiatrist to conduct a specialized interview using techniques designed to access long-term memories in patients with cognitive decline. During this session, Carpenter's lucidity fluctuated, but he provided fragments of information that proved invaluable. He spoke of protecting the light and fulfilling Thomas's final wish. Most significantly, he described moving sacred vessels from the first temple to the final temple. When gently pressed about the location of this final temple, Carpenter became agitated, repeating, "Where it began, the circle must close." That's what Thomas always said. The circle must close. This cryptic statement perplexed investigators until Detective Hayes made a connection to the circular hand gestures Nancy Harmon had made while speaking of the light during her psychiatric evaluations. Reviewing the original case files yet again, Hayes noticed something that had been overlooked: a small sketch in the margin of Nancy's hospital intake form, drawn by the attending nurse. The simple drawing showed 3 circles arranged in a triangle pattern, with lines connecting them. Below was a note: "Patient repeatedly drew this pattern during initial assessment. Possible significance unknown." The symbol meant nothing to most of the investigation team, but when shown to an architectural historian consulting on the case, she immediately recognized it. "That's the window pattern from the original First Presbyterian Church," she explained. "The old building, not the current one. It was demolished in 1986 after the congregation built their new facility." Archives confirmed that the old church had featured 3 circular windows arranged in a triangular pattern on its eastern wall. More significantly, Reverend Douglas had fought against the demolition, arguing unsuccessfully that the original structure had historical and spiritual significance that should be preserved. The land where the old church had stood had remained vacant until 1990, when it was purchased by the Millfield School District and converted into a maintenance facility and storage yard. The original foundation of the church remained intact, used as the foundation for the new, utilitarian structure. With this new lead, investigators obtained permission to search the school district facility. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they focused on the area beneath the building corresponding to where the church's altar would have been located. On June 3, 2024, nearly 7 weeks after the initial discovery in the Harmon basement, excavation beneath the concrete floor of the maintenance facility revealed a sealed metal container approximately 6 feet long by 3 feet wide. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating white cloth, were the partial skeletal remains of 3 children. Forensic examination would later confirm these were the remains of Catherine, Elizabeth, and James Harmon. Evidence of trauma to the cervical vertebrae suggested all 3 had died by strangulation. Trace evidence indicated they had been initially buried in soil consistent with the basement of the Harmon home, then moved to this secondary location many years later. The container also held several items that reinforced the connection to the Covenant of Light. A bound manuscript of Douglas's writings titled The Illumination Through Triple Vessels, silver pendants with the 3-circle symbol, and a collection of photographs showing the triplets at various ages, their faces circled in red ink. Most disturbing was a handwritten letter, apparently composed by William Carpenter, explaining the reinterment of the remains. As the last keeper of the covenant, I have fulfilled our sacred duty. The vessels have been returned to holy ground, where their light first illuminated our path. When the great darkness comes, their sacrifice will sustain us all. The letter was dated October 2019, consistent with the forensic timeline for the removal of the remains from the Harmon basement. With this evidence, prosecutors were able to bring posthumous charges against Reverend Thomas Douglas and Dr. Edwin Porter for the murders of the Harmon triplets. William Carpenter, despite his advanced age and cognitive decline, was charged as an accessory after the fact for his role in moving the remains. The exact role of Richard and Nancy Harmon remained ambiguous. Evidence suggested they had been manipulated by Douglas, possibly exploiting Richard's financial desperation and Nancy's history of mental health issues. Whether they had been willing participants or coerced victims would likely never be known with certainty. The case had profound implications for Millfield. Several prominent citizens were implicated in the conspiracy of silence that had protected the Covenant members. The Presbyterian Church underwent a crisis of faith and leadership. Families who had known and trusted Reverend Douglas struggled to reconcile the respected spiritual leader with the monster revealed by the investigation. For Detective Allison Hayes, the case represented both closure and the opening of new wounds. "We know what happened to these children now," she told reporters at a press conference, announcing the discovery of the remains. "We can give them a proper burial and bring some measure of justice, even if the main perpetrators are beyond earthly punishment." But the resolution of the Harmon case had revealed darker currents running beneath Millfield's placid surface. As investigators continued to examine the activities of the Covenant of Light, evidence emerged suggesting the triplets might not have been their only victim. Among William Carpenter's possessions, police found a leather-bound book containing names, dates, and locations spanning from many of the entries corresponded to missing persons cases throughout Pennsylvania and neighboring states, cases that had never been connected to Millfield or the Covenant. Most disturbing was a series of entries from the 1990s, long after the Harmon case had gone cold, suggesting Douglas had continued his rituals after relocating to Arizona. The final entry, dated just 1 week before Douglas's death in 2001, contained a cryptic message: "The final vessel prepared, the light sustained for another generation." the covenant fulfilled. What exactly this meant remained unclear until investigators made a shocking discovery while examining records from Douglas's spiritual center in Arizona. Among his followers in his final years was a woman named Emily Carpenter, William Carpenter's daughter, who had moved west in 1998 with her 3 young children. Photographs from the center showed Emily's children, a girl and 2 boys, all with the same auburn hair, same heart-shaped face. Not identical triplets like the Harmons, but triplets nonetheless. Public records indicated Emily had returned to Pennsylvania following Douglas's death, settling in Pittsburgh. Her children, now adults, had apparently scattered across the country. Attempts to locate them for questioning revealed disturbing gaps in documentation. No recent employment records, no social media presence, no digital footprint of any kind. After approximately As Detective Hayes prepared to expand the investigation to include these new potential victims, a package arrived at the Millfield Police Department addressed to her personally. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing the 3-circle symbol and a handwritten note: "The light cannot be extinguished. The covenant endures. Look away, Detective Hayes." The package had no return address, but postmark indicated it had been mailed from Millfield itself, suggesting that even now, decades after the original crimes, members of the Covenant of Light, or perhaps a new generation of followers, remained active in the community. For Hayes, this transformed what she had viewed as a historical case into an urgent, ongoing threat. Somewhere in Millfield, perhaps walking its streets, shopping in its stores, or attending its churches, were individuals who had inherited the twisted legacy of Thomas Douglas. People who viewed child sacrifice not as an abomination, but as a sacred duty. People who might even now be identifying new vessels for their perverse rituals. As summer deepened in Millfield, bringing with it the same oppressive heat that had blanketed the town in 1980, Hayes found herself looking at the children in the town park with new eyes. Behind the splash of the playground sprinklers and the cheerful shrieks, she sensed a shadow, the long reach of a darkness that had taken root decades ago and never truly been extirpated. The Harmon triplets would finally receive a proper burial, their remains interred in Millfield Cemetery, with a simple marble headstone bearing their names and the dates of their short lives. But the case that began with their disappearance was far from over. In fact, as Hayes would soon discover, the most terrifying revelations were yet to come. Revelations that would reach beyond Millfield, beyond Pennsylvania, beyond even the twisted theology of the Covenant of Light, into something far more ancient and implacable, something that had merely used Douglas and his followers as instruments in a design too vast and terrible for human comprehension. The true horror was just beginning to unfold. The summer heat in Millfield seemed to amplify the growing sense of unease. As Detective Allison Hayes stared at the threatening note in her office, "The light cannot be extinguished. The covenant endures. Look away, Detective Hayes." The weight of what they were uncovering settled over her like a shroud. This was no longer simply an investigation into a historical crime. It was something active, present, pulsing beneath the surface of the town she had sworn to protect. The Harmon case had cracked open a door, revealing glimpses of something vast and insidious. William Carpenter's leather-bound book, with its list of names and dates, suggested the Covenant of Light's activities extended far beyond the 3 children buried beneath the old church. But it was the connection to Emily Carpenter and her triplets that truly disturbed Hayes. "We need to find those children," she told her task force during an emergency meeting. "I don't care if they are adults now. They may be in danger, or they may be perpetuating the cycle. Either way, they are the key to understanding how far this goes." The search for Emily Carpenter's triplets, Abigail, Daniel, and Joseph, proved challenging. Born in 1991, they would now be 33 years old. But as Hayes had discovered, their digital footprint vanished around. The last concrete documentation was their graduation from Arizona State University in After that, scattered records suggested they had moved with their mother back to Pennsylvania, but the trail grew increasingly fragmented. Emily herself was easier to locate. Public records showed she owned a modest home in Pittsburgh's Shadyside neighborhood. Tax filings indicated employment as an administrative assistant at a wellness center, specializing in alternative healing modalities. On paper, she appeared utterly ordinary, a middle-aged woman with a conventional job and no criminal record. Hayes dispatched 2 detectives to interview her, but they returned with troubling news. The house in Shadyside stood empty, mail overflowing the box. Neighbors reported Emily had left suddenly about 2 weeks earlier, coinciding almost exactly with the discovery of the Harmon triplets' remains. She knew, Hayes realized. Someone warned her we were getting close. This suspicion was reinforced when forensic analysis of the threatening note revealed fingerprints matching those of a Millfield County clerk who had access to case files. Joan Foster, daughter-in-law of Diane Foster, the triplets' former teacher who had noticed changes in their behavior before their disappearance, had been quietly monitoring the investigation and presumably feeding information to remaining Covenant members. When confronted, Joan Foster maintained her innocence, claiming the envelope must have been contaminated in the mailroom. Without direct evidence connecting her to the Covenant, investigators could only place her under surveillance while continuing to pursue other leads. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Eleanor Vance, the forensic anthropologist who had examined the Harmon remains, requested a meeting with Detective Hayes 3 days after the threatening note arrived. "There's something unusual about the bones that I didn't include in my official report," Vance explained, closing Hayes's office door behind her. "I wasn't sure what to make of it initially, and I didn't want to sound unscientific." Hayes had come to respect Vance's methodical approach and precise mind. For her to withhold information and to seem hesitant now was completely out of character. "What did you find?" Hayes. Vance placed several enlarged photographs on Hayes's desk, microscopic images of the Harmon children's bones. "These markings," she said, pointing to a series of fine lines visible on the surfaces of various bone fragments. "At first I thought they were cut marks from some kind of ritual mutilation, but they are too precise, too consistent across all 3 sets of remains." "What are you suggesting?" Hayes asked. "They are not cut marks," Vance replied, her scientific certainty momentarily faltering. "They appear to be growth patterns, almost like the bone was altered at a cellular level." Hayes struggled to understand. "Are you saying these children had some kind of bone disease?" "No," Vance said firmly. "These patterns don't match any known pathology. And there's more." She produced another photograph, this one showing a cross-section of a bone fragment. "We found traces of an unidentified crystalline structure incorporated into the bone matrix itself. It's like nothing I have ever seen before." Hayes felt a chill despite the summer heat. "Could it be some kind of mineral deposit from the burial site?" "That was my first thought," Vance admitted. "But these structures show signs of vascularization. They were growing within the bone, while the children were alive. And based on the density pattern, the growth accelerated in the weeks or months before death." The implications were disturbing. Had the Harmon children been subjected to some kind of experimentation? Had Douglas's obsession with them as vessels for divine light been more than metaphorical? "There's one more thing," Vance said, her voice lower now. "I have seen these patterns once before, years ago. I was consulting on an unrelated case in Arizona, 3 unidentified juvenile remains found in the desert outside Sedona. The timing aligned perfectly with Thomas Douglas's death and the final entry in Carpenter's book. The final vessel prepared. The light sustained for another generation. The covenant fulfilled. Were they Emily Carpenter's children?" Hayes asked, though she already suspected the answer. "DNA was too degraded for identification at the time," Vance replied. "But the age and sex of the remains would be consistent, 2 males and 1 female, approximately 10 years old. But Emily's triplets would have been about 10 in 2001, Hayes said, "and we have records of them graduating college in 2014. They couldn't be the same children." Vance nodded. Exactly, which raises an even more disturbing possibility. The implication hung in the air between them. If the remains in Arizona were Emily's original triplets, then who or what had taken their place? Who had continued living as Abigail, Daniel, and Joseph Carpenter, graduating from college, creating the semblance of normal lives before vanishing in... This macabre revelation shifted the investigation dramatically. What had begun as a historical murder case now spiraled into something far more complex and unsettling, a multi-generational conspiracy involving possible child substitution, biological anomalies, and a continuing threat. Hayes immediately requested the case files from the Arizona remains. She also dispatched officers to interview former faculty and classmates of the Carpenter triplets at Arizona State University. Something wasn't adding up and the clock was ticking. If Joan Foster had indeed warned Emily Carpenter about the investigation, other Covenant members might be destroying evidence or preparing to flee. The Arizona case files arrived within days, confirming Vance's recollection. The remains found outside Sedona showed the same unusual bone structures as the Harmon children. They had been discovered in a remote area by hikers, partially exposed by recent flash floods. No suspects had ever been identified. The case had gone cold. The remains eventually interred in an unmarked grave. Most interesting was a note in the medical examiner's report indicating similar cases might exist. Anomalous bone structure suggests possible connection to Jane John Doe cases in Pennsylvania, 1980, Vermont, 1987, and Oregon, 1994. Recommend cross-reference. This pattern aligned perfectly with the dates in William Carpenter's book and with locations where Thomas Douglas was known to have traveled during those years. Meanwhile, interviews with faculty and classmates from Arizona State painted an unsettling picture of the Carpenter triplets. Professors described them as brilliant but strange, maintaining perfect GPAs while displaying unusual social behaviors. One psychology professor noted that they moved in perfect synchronization, as if sharing a single consciousness. A roommate reported that Abigail never seemed to sleep and spoke in odd cadences, like she was translating her thoughts from another language. Most disturbing was an interview with a former boyfriend of Abigail's, who described a terrifying incident in their senior year. "We were hiking in the desert, and she cut her arm on a cactus," he recalled. "But the blood, it wasn't right. It was too bright, almost luminous, and the cut sealed itself within minutes. When I asked her about it, she just stared at me with this empty expression and said, 'The light protects its vessels.' We broke up the next day. I always told myself I imagined it, but deep down I knew something wasn't human about her." As Hayes compiled these accounts, a chilling pattern emerged. The Carpenter triplets had maintained a convincing facade of normalcy while concealing fundamental differences. They had excelled academically but struggled with basic social interactions. They had avoided medical examinations, never visited campus health services, and insisted on private housing after their freshman year. These discoveries led Hayes to re-examine the Harmon case with fresh eyes. If the Covenant of Light wasn't simply a deranged cult, but something far more sinister, an organization facilitating some kind of substitution or transformation, then what had really happened to Catherine, Elizabeth, and James Harmon? Dr. Vance's findings suggested the triplets had undergone some kind of physiological change before death, their bones infiltrated by an unknown crystalline substance. The Covenant's writings referred to them as vessels for divine light. What if this wasn't metaphorical but literal, an attempt to use human children as hosts for something else? This hypothesis, though bordering on the incredible, would explain Nancy Harmon's cryptic statement that her children were in the light now. It would explain Reverend Douglas's obsession with triplets, specifically 3 vessels for whatever entity or substance he believed could be transferred or preserved through this grotesque process. Most importantly, it would explain why Douglas and his followers had continued the pattern across decades and multiple locations, not as a series of sacrifices, but as a sequence of attempts to perfect a technique culminating in whatever had happened with Emily Carpenter's children in. The full implications were too disturbing to voice aloud, even within the task force. Hayes found herself working increasingly alone, following threads that seemed to lead beyond the boundaries of conventional criminal investigation into something approaching cosmic horror. Her breakthrough came when analyzing property records associated with Covenant members. A pattern emerged. Small land purchases in remote areas near sources of naturally occurring electromagnetic anomalies, fault lines, mineral deposits, areas of unusual geomagnetic activity. The Harmon house, she discovered, had been built over a previously undocumented iron ore deposit. The old Presbyterian church stood at the intersection of two underground water currents. Hayes consulted with a geologist from the State University, who confirmed these locations would exhibit unusual electromagnetic properties. These would be places where the barrier between different types of energy fields might be more permeable, he explained, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of her questions. Some indigenous cultures considered such locations sacred or dangerous, places where the veil between worlds was thinner. The scientist in Hayes resisted such mystical interpretations, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. The Covenant hadn't selected these locations randomly. They believed something could pass through at these points, something they called the light. With this framework in mind, Hayes began searching for similar electromagnetic anomalies in the Millfield area, places where Covenant members might attempt another ritual now that their activities had been exposed. Using geological survey data and the geologist's parameters, she identified 3 potential locations within a 30-mile radius. The most promising was an abandoned limestone quarry 10 miles outside town. Not only did it possess the electromagnetic properties the Covenant seemed to favor, but it also showed recent signs of activity. Fresh tire tracks approaching a sealed entrance, power lines inexplicably restored to an abandoned office building, unusual light patterns reported by nearby residents at night. Hayes knew she should wait for backup, obtain proper warrants, approach this as a standard law enforcement operation. But something in her gut told her time was running out, that whatever cycle had begun with the Harmon triplets in 1980 was approaching another critical point. On the night of July 15, 2024, Hayes drove alone to the quarry. She told herself she was merely conducting preliminary surveillance, gathering evidence to justify a formal operation. Deep down, she knew she was crossing a line, driven by an intuition she couldn't articulate even to herself. The quarry was eerily silent as she approached on foot, having parked her unmarked car half a mile down the access road. The abandoned office building showed no external lights, but as she drew closer, Hayes detected a faint bluish glow emanating from the windows, not the steady illumination of conventional lighting but a pulsing, rhythmic radiance. Moving silently across the gravel yard, Hayes positioned herself beneath a partially open window. Voices drifted out multiple speakers, engaged in what sounded like a ceremonial chant. Through the narrow opening, she could see approximately a dozen robed figures arranged in a circle. In the center stood a familiar figure, Emily Carpenter, but it was what surrounded Emily that froze the blood in Hayes's veins. 3 figures stood motionless beside her, their faces obscured by hoods. They were tall, unnaturally still, their postures suggesting bodies not entirely comfortable with the constraints of human anatomy. When one turned slightly, Hayes caught a glimpse beneath the hood, not a face, but a suggestion of one. Features that seemed to shift and flow, like liquid suspended in the general shape of human countenance. At the far end of the room stood an apparatus Hayes couldn't immediately identify, a framework of metal and crystal surrounding what appeared to be 3 child-sized containers filled with swirling, luminous fluid. With sickening clarity, Hayes realized she was witnessing another transference in progress. 3 new vessels were being prepared. Before she could retreat to call for backup, Hayes felt a hand clamp over her mouth. She was dragged backward, away from the window, into the shadows behind the building. As she struggled against her captor, a voice whispered urgently in her ear, "Stop fighting. I'm trying to save you." The hand released her. and Hayes spun to confront her assailant, a woman in her early 30s with auburn hair and haunted eyes that reflected the quarry's moonlight with an unnatural gleam. Abigail Carpenter? Hayes guessed. The woman flinched at the name. That's what they called the original. I have been wearing her for 23 years now, but the transference was imperfect. Parts of her remained memories, emotions, fragments of human consciousness. Hayes fought the urge to draw her weapon, sensing this encounter might be her only chance to understand what they were facing. What are you? We don't have a name you could pronounce, the being that looked like Abigail replied. In your mythology, we might be closest to what you call angels, though that comparison flatters us. We are older than your species, existing primarily as patterns of energy. For eons, we observed your world without direct interaction, until Thomas Douglas somehow contacted you, Hayes surmised. A mirthless smile crossed Abigail's face. Douglas didn't find us. We found him a mind uniquely susceptible to our influence due to a rare neurological condition. He was our conduit, helping us understand how to create suitable vessels for physical manifestation. The triplets, Hayes whispered. Multiple connected vessels create a stable matrix, Abigail confirmed. Single humans can't contain us, the neural architecture collapses. But three connected minds, especially with genetic similarities. You used children, Hayes said, disgust evident in her voice. The vessels must be adaptable, their neural pathways still forming. Abigail replied without emotion. Adults resist the integration. Children can be remade. Hayes struggled to process the implications. The Harmons failed somehow. The crystalline structures hadn't properly integrated before Douglas performed the ritual. The transfer was incomplete. We couldn't fully manifest. So you tried again with other children, Hayes said. Vermont, Oregon, Arizona. Refinements of the process, Abigail acknowledged. By 2001, with Emily's children, we achieved partial success. My brothers and I could maintain these forms, though imperfectly. We could observe your world directly, gather information, prepare for the true integration. Which is happening now, Hayes realized, glancing back toward the building. Those containers, they are for new children, aren't they? For the first time, something like human emotion crossed Abigail's face, distress, perhaps even shame. 3 vessels from the local foster system. No families to miss them. Emily selected them months ago. Why are you telling me this? Hayes demanded. Why stop me from calling for backup? Because the human part of me, the fragments of the original Abigail, has grown stronger over time, she replied. Human emotions, human attachments, they have contaminated me. My brothers call it corruption. They want to transfer to new, perfect vessels and abandon these compromised forms. But I have come to believe coexistence might be possible. Symbiosis rather than replacement. Hayes regarded the being skeptically. So you are what, defecting? I'm proposing an alternative to the extinction of your species, Abigail replied. If the full integration succeeds tonight, more will follow. They are waiting, thousands of my kind, observing through the dimensional barrier. Your world will become merely new territory for colonization. The scale of the threat was almost incomprehensible. Hayes had entered this investigation seeking justice for 3 murdered children. Now she faced an invasion from entities that existed beyond conventional understanding. What can I possibly do against something like this? She asked. The transfer requires precise electromagnetic conditions, Abigail explained. The equipment in that building is channeling and amplifying the quarry's natural properties. Disrupt it, and the gateway collapses. Before Hayes could respond, a shrill tone emanated from the building, a single pure note that seemed to resonate through bone and tissue. The blue glow intensified, visible now even from behind the structure. It's beginning, Abigail said urgently. The gateway is forming. We have minutes at most. Hayes made a split-second decision. The power supply, where is it? Underground conduit, eastern side of the building. But they will have guards. Hayes was already moving, drawing her service weapon as she circled toward the east. As predicted, two robed figures stood beside a heavy-duty generator connected to thick cables running into the building. Neither appeared armed, their attention fixed on the ceremony inside. Using the element of surprise, Hayes approached from behind, incapacitating both with swift, decisive blows. The generator, an industrial model, was secured with a padlocked control panel. Hayes didn't hesitate. She fired twice into the machine's vital components. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The generator died with a whine of protesting metal. Inside the building, the blue light flickered and dimmed. Shouts of alarm turned to screams of what sounded like genuine terror. Hayes was retreating toward cover when the night exploded into chaos. The building's windows blew outward in a shower of glass and blinding light. A sound beyond description, part scream, part electronic howl, tore through the quarry. The ground beneath her feet trembled as if in sympathetic vibration. Through the now empty window frames, Hayes witnessed a scene of impossible physics. The ritual space was filled with whirling fragments of light and darkness, like reality itself was tearing apart. The robed figures fled in panic, many collapsing before reaching exits. In the center, where Emily had stood, a vortex of energy seemed to be collapsing inward, drawing everything toward its center: papers, equipment, even sections of the floor. Hayes caught a glimpse of the three containers, now cracked and empty. Whatever had been inside, children or something else, was no longer visible. A hand gripped her arm with inhuman strength. Abigail's form was deteriorating, her features flowing like wax, her outline blurring at the edges. "The gateway is collapsing chaotically," she shouted over the increasing din. "Without proper closure, it will consume everything within range. You need to run now." Hayes didn't need further urging. As the building began to collapse inward, she sprinted toward the access road, not looking back even as the noise reached painful intensities. She had nearly reached her vehicle when the final implosion occurred, a moment of absolute silence followed by a concussive blast that knocked her from her feet. When Hayes regained consciousness minutes later, she turned to see nothing but a smoldering crater where the Quarry office had stood. No structure, no equipment, no bodies, just a perfect circular depression in the earth. Its edges crystallized as if subjected to impossible heat. Of Abigail there was no sign. The official report on the Millfield Quarry incident described an explosion caused by illegally stored mining explosives. The deaths, 12 bodies eventually recovered, were attributed to members of a doomsday cult engaged in an apparent mass suicide. The 3 missing foster children were never found, despite extensive searches. Only Detective Allison Hayes knew the truth, or something approaching it. She had glimpsed realities beyond human comprehension, entities that viewed our world as territory for colonization, our children as vessels to be remade and occupied. She had witnessed the beginning of an invasion that was only temporarily halted. In the months following the Quarry incident, Hayes continued investigating the remaining threads of the Covenant of Light. Most led nowhere: records destroyed, witnesses disappeared, evidence contaminated. The organization appeared to have collapsed with the failure of the final ritual, its members scattered or dead. But occasionally she would catch glimpses of something that suggested the threat wasn't entirely eliminated. Unusual electrical disturbances reported near sites associated with the Covenant. Children in various cities exhibiting synchronous behaviors without apparent connection. Brief sightings of a woman with auburn hair watching from a distance, a woman whose appearance shifted slightly depending on the angle of observation. The Harmon triplets were finally laid to rest in a quiet ceremony, attended only by distant relatives and a handful of Millfield residents old enough to remember them. Their headstone bore a simple inscription: Catherine, Elizabeth, and James Harmon, beloved children, finally at peace. But Detective Hayes knew peace was not guaranteed, not for the Harmon children, not for the other victims across the decades, not for humanity itself. Somewhere beyond conventional perception, the entities Abigail had called her kind were still watching, still waiting for another opportunity, another gateway, another set of perfect vessels. She kept a small piece of the crystalline substance from the Quarry crater in a lead-lined box in her desk drawer, a reminder that some mysteries should remain unsolved, some doors forever closed. The crystal occasionally pulsed with faint internal light, even within its shielded container. On particularly dark nights, Hayes would sometimes catch it responding to something only it could sense, a signal from somewhere beyond the veil between worlds. The Harmon case was officially closed, but Hayes knew better. The true horror had merely been postponed, and somewhere in the vast darkness between worlds, the light was gathering strength for its return.